It was late 1982 and Monsieur Shi Pei Pu was the toast of Paris. Lovers of music, theatre and Chinese culture could not get enough of this witty and sophisticated performer, one of the top singers of Beijing opera. The French public was especially fascinated by Mr. Shu's speciality. He was particularly convincing in performing female roles, as dictated by his genre's tradition. Perhaps too convincing. As much as Paris was open to Chinese artists, France and the Western world was still shivering under the shadow cast by the Cold War. Communist and Western countries did not usually get along, and it was only a matter of time before Shi Pei Pu attracted the attention of the DST, the French Internal Security Agency. It appeared that the performer had a close relationship with a French national called Bernard Boursicot. Nothing wrong there, but Mr. Boursicot happened to be a civil servant employed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and one who had worked beyond the Iron Curtain, first in China, then Mongolia. It was enough to set alarm bells ringing. So on June 30th, 1983, the DST made their move and arrested Bernard Boursicot on charge of espionage. The arrest of a civil servant suspected of being a double agent was already a big piece of news in itself, but the French press and public could not expect the twists and turns of the scandal that ensued. A story of friendship, love, sacrifice, and betrayal. This is the story of the Shi Pei Pu affair, one of the most unbelievable scandals of the Cold War era. Let's get to meet our first protagonist, Bernard Boursicot. He was born on August 12th, 1944 in Vannes, a mid-sized town in Brittany, northern France. Bernard's parents were by no means wealthy, but lived comfortably and thus could afford to send their son to an all-male boarding school. Growing up, Bernard became, by all accounts, an attractive young man, standing at 5'9" or 175 centimeters and flaunting the physique of a swimmer. In his later high school years, Bernard went out with a girlfriend, but their relationship never became intimate. Young Boursicot, however, was far from being a virgin. Whilst attending boarding school, he had participated in what he would later call schoolboy sex, which he described as a schoolboy's game or a rite of passage. But at the age of 18, Bernard promised himself he would abandon these schoolboy games and do his best to find himself a girlfriend. The recent high school graduate was after passion, love, and especially adventure. Chafing at the boundaries of small-town life, Bernard applied for a position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Despite being described as a career diplomat, technically, Bernard was an office employee hired by the ministry on a series of short-term contracts. Nonetheless, Bernard's thirst for adventure would be quenched, and the ministry posted him to some pretty exotic locations, starting with Beijing. And here we need to provide some quick context. By the early 1960s, the Cold War was all the rage, and Western powers were not exactly best pals with communist countries. But starting in 1960, cracks had begun to show in the alliance between the two communist giants, the Soviet Union and China. To oversimplify a complex situation, Chairman Mao Zedong accused Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev of being too friendly with the West. Furthermore, Moscow had shown support to India, with which China had an ongoing border dispute. In Mao's eyes, the Soviet government had become a cabal of revisionists, traitors, and imperialists. So China had drifted away from the USSR, which paradoxically brought her closer to the West, eager to exploit the enmity within the communist bloc. In January 1964, French President Charles de Gaulle had formally recognized Mao's communist government, and in February, France became the first Western power to open an embassy in Beijing after the Korean War. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs needed to beef up their personnel in Beijing, and so it was that a 20-year-old Bernard Boursicot received his first assignment, serving at the embassy accountant for a period of 30 months. His hopes of an adventurous life, however, were almost immediately quashed. Beijing was freezing cold and unwelcoming. Freedom of movement for foreigners was severely limited, and Chinese citizens absolutely avoided any contact with Westerners due to the constant fear of being arrested by the Communist Party's security services. This sinister apparatus for surveillance and repression included the Ministry of Public Security, or MPS, which oversaw the regular police forces, secret police, and the administration of the Laogai labor camps, responsible for the death of up to 25 million people. The NPS was a direct descendant of the previous service, the Shi Pei Pu, or Social Affairs Department. The department's first director, back in 1939, had been Spymaster Kang Sheng, known in the West as Mao's equivalent of Lavrenti Beria. Let's keep Mr. Kang in mind, as this name will become relevant later in our story. And let's zoom back onto Monsieur Boursicot. His first months in Beijing were lonely and miserable, as he was mostly shunned even by his fellow nationals. The career diplomats at the embassy maintained a polite facade, but essentially treated him as an outsider, an unrefined and uncultured boy from the sticks. His co-workers even gave him a cruel nickname by replacing the S in his surname with a second R. He became Le Boursicot, which is French for young donkey. Bernard was starved for interaction, and he finally found some human warmth at a Christmas party organised by the recently reopened British Embassy. There, Bernard got friendly with an attractive secretary, later described as a dead ringer for actress Julie Christie. Some days later, Bernard and his Julie Christie attended another party hosted by the French ambassador's second-in-command. As much as Bernard enjoyed his blonde friend's company, he was immediately distracted by an unusual sight: a young Chinese man in his mid-20s conversing in perfect French. Boursicot was intrigued. The young man was short, of slight build and with delicate features, and yet he appeared to command the attention of the room, like a natural performer. Bernard asked the mysterious guest, "Why aren't you dancing? There are a lot of beautiful girls here." To which the other replied, "I don't really like it so much," and simply turned away. After this awkward start, the two eventually hit it off. The young Chinese man introduced himself as Shi Pei Pu, a former performer of traditional Chinese opera and now an author of state-approved plays about the progress of factory workers. As a teenager, Pei Pu had studied French, which made him a natural fit to teach the Chinese language to foreign diplomats. Bernard became his latest student, and thus the two forged a very close friendship. Pei Pu became Bernard's guide, taking him to parks, monuments, buildings and restaurants usually inaccessible to foreigners. All the while, the Chinese man would regale his French friend with thrilling tales from the operas he had performed. Xu had been greatly celebrated as an interpreter of female roles, his greatest success being as the lead in The Story of the Butterfly. In this popular romantic tragedy, a young woman impersonates her brother so she can attend an imperial school for civil servants. One of her fellow students falls in love with the new boy before realizing that he is in fact a girl. The ruse is discovered and the female protagonist is forced into an arranged marriage. The unhappiness is too much to bear and both lovers eventually end their lives, but their souls will continue to live on as butterflies, flying away together. In March 1965, Bernard received a letter with great news. He had been accepted to join a jungle expedition in Brazil. This was almost out of the blue, considering he had applied back in 1961. Nonetheless, Boursicot was over the moon and decided to resign his post at the embassy. Pei Pu's reaction was far from enthusiastic. "So, I will not see you anymore. I am sad." The two friends spent every spare minute together. One evening, while standing on a moonlit bridge, Pei Pu told again the story of the butterfly, but this time there was a different ending. "Look at my hands. Look at my face. That story of the butterfly, it is my story too." It was time for Shi Pei Pu to reveal the truth about himself, or rather, herself. Pei Pu had been born a she, the third of 3 daughters, in a very conservative household who longed for a baby boy, as per pre-revolutionary traditions. Pei Pu's grandmother, the real queen of the house, had even issued a terrifying decree. If the third child was to be a girl, Mr. Xu should repudiate his wife and remarry. When baby girl Pei Pu was born, Mrs. Xu was terrified. What if her tyrannical mother-in-law enacted her threat? And so, Pei Pu's parents, with the help of their midwife, enacted a complex ruse. They dressed up the new baby as a boy and raised Pei Pu as a male. The more they progressed with their lie, the more difficult it became to pull out of it. You see, as a young adult, Pei Pu had become a well-known opera singer. Rather, she was known to her fans as being a man who excelled at performing female roles. Her success, and her later employment as a state-sponsored playwright, meant that she was pretty much under the authorities' watchful eye. If she were to reveal her real gender, she and her family would have to admit to this years-long ruse. And what was the problem with that? Quoting from journalist Joyce Wadler, writing for the New York Times, "It is far too dangerous in Mao's China, where men and women are supposed to be equals, to admit that one follows an old, feudal sense of values. But now Xu is telling Boursicot, in doing so, she is trusting him with her life." Boursicot gladly agreed to keep the secret. "You are my best friend. I will tell nobody." But something changed within Bernard after that revelation. Was Miss Shi Pei Pu only his best friend, or something more? Now that Bernard knew that Pei Pu was a woman, was he falling in love? That's what he felt at the time, at least. So much so that Bernard could not get rid of another thought. Their relationship should become intimate. Pei Pu reciprocated Bernard's feelings, and so they set a date for them to sleep together for the first time. For Boursicot, this would be the very first time with a woman, and naturally, despite Pei Pu's hands-on guidance, it was a rather awkward affair. As related by Joyce Wadler, Bernard had to admit that this first time with a woman was not as erotic as it had been with the boys he had slept with when he was a teenager, perhaps because all the planning had made them tense. Nonetheless, they continued to have sex, albeit infrequently, over the following weeks. Naturally, they maintained their relationship as a total secret to the outside world, and especially to the ubiquitous MPS agents. Xu and Boursicot were just two male friends hanging about. At the end of December 1965, Bernard was due to leave China for Brazil. Just days before his flight, Pei Pu dropped some serious news. She may be expecting a baby from him. It was too late for the Frenchman to rearrange his plans, but he made a solemn promise to his lover. "I will be back for sure. I don't know how. Just remember, I will be back." And he was right. Bernard Boursicot returned to Beijing in 1970, this time as an archivist with the French embassy. Almost immediately, he set out to find Shi Pei Pu and to find out if they had had a child after all. But this was no easy task. Her lover had moved house in the past 5 years, and Bernard wasn't sure whether or not he had the right address. Besides, now it was even more dangerous for a Westerner to go around asking too many questions, since in May 1966, China had been caught up in the throes of Mao's Cultural Revolution, a violent movement intended to rid the country of alleged capitalists, counter-revolutionaries, and spies. Mao's Red Guards and MPS agents ran rampant, beating, humiliating, arresting, and killing thousands of enemies of the state on a daily basis. Between 1966 and 1976, an estimated 2 million people lost their lives to the Cultural Revolution. Bernard was well aware of the risks involved, but eventually he tracked down Pei Pu's new address, a large tenement building where she lived with her mother. Dodging Red Guard roadblocks and inquisitive looks of neighbours, eventually Boursicot was reunited with his lover. After sharing a passionate kiss, Bernard asked Pei Pu, "Is there a child? Do we have a baby?" She replied, "We do. I will tell you later." Pei Pu sensed it was too dangerous for Bernard to stay and urged him to go away. He returned 3 days later, but just when Pei Pu was about to tell him about their child, 3 policemen burst into Xu's apartment, followed by a mob of angry neighbours, loudly accusing Boursicot of being a foreign spy. The French archivist kept his cool, claiming to be an admirer of Chairman Mao, who was just visiting his great friend, Comrade Xu, to learn more about the Cultural Revolution. The police fell for the ruse, and Bernard was free to go. For the ensuing weeks, however, Bernard and Pei Pu were not allowed to meet, as China descended more and more into Mao's paranoid killing spree. The two lovers could only exchange doleful glances, whilst sitting on 2 benches separated by an 8-lane highway. One day, Bernard received great news. Pei Pu's superior at the Writers' Association had given her permission to meet twice a week with her French friend, provided they used their time to study Mao's doctrine. It was during one of those study sessions that Bernard finally learned about their child. The boy was born on August 12, 1966. His French name was Bertrand, his Chinese name, Dudu. He was growing strong and healthy, but his features were partly, unmistakably, European, which may have attracted unwanted attention during the Cultural Revolution. That's why Pei Pu and her mother had sent Dudu to live with a trusted family of friends near the Soviet border. Bernard swore to himself that he would do anything in his power to protect Pei Pu, to protect Dudu, and if possible, to help them move to the West. But would he go as far as committing treason? After 2 months of private lessons, Pei Pu told Bernard that they were still allowed to meet, but from then on he would take lessons from another teacher, a government official who simply introduced himself as Kang. And here is where our love story veers into spy territory. Let's have a look at our new friend, Mr. Kang. Boursicot would later describe him as a low-level police officer, but according to FBI agent and author T. Van Meegers, this guy was actually some big fish within the Ministry of Public Security, the MPS. According to French journalists Roger Faligeau and Remy Corfer, Kang's real identity was Yu Zhensang, head of the MPS Foreign Affairs Bureau no less. This Yu had an interesting backstory which is worth mentioning. His biological father was one Yu Chi-wei, and Mr. Chi-wei had been the first husband of a lady called Jian Qing, who would later go on to marry Chairman Mao Zedong himself. But there's more. Yu Zhenchan had been adopted by Kang Sheng. Remember him? Mao's barrier and earlier communist spy master? So maybe the alias Kang had been chosen to honour the late director of Mao's early secret police. That we'll never know, but what we do know is that Bernard and Kang hit it off. And sometime after their very first meeting, they shook hands on a very dangerous deal. Bernard would steal classified documents from the French embassy's archives and hand them over to Kang. The MPS agent was not after information about France itself, considered a friendly nation. Instead, Boursicot was to provide intelligence about US and Soviet policies which might be handled at the embassy. Kang was especially interested in diplomatic cables sent from the French delegation in Moscow to the one in Beijing. Since the Sino-Soviet split, China had recalled its own diplomats and desperately needed intelligence about those imperialist and revisionist Soviets. We should specify that it's not entirely clear how Boursicot and Kang reached this agreement. Boursicot later stated that it was his idea to volunteer documents to the MPS handler as a means to ensure his protection over Pei Pu and Dudu. The already quoted T. Van Meegers disagrees. Considering Kang's alleged high-ranking status, it's more realistic that the proposal came from the Chinese officer. Either cooperate, or we expel you and arrest your friend. Now, it's legitimate to ask, were Pei Pu and Kang somehow in cahoots? Had it all been some sort of honey-trap scheme, a master plan woven by the MPS leading to Bernard's defection? That's another question that we'll never have a definitive answer to. According to author Todd Hoffman, Shi Pei Pu was very likely an MPS informant, and that's why she'd been able to attend diplomatic events before the Cultural Revolution. But did the MPS know about her gender-related secrets? Unlikely. Hoffman speculates that the secret police's involvement in the affair had not been planned, and Kang may have decided to intervene only after learning that a French civil servant was taking lessons from a Chinese citizen. Regardless, Bernard took his espionage assignment like a pro. As an archivist, he had free entry to the embassy's mailroom. There, he picked and chose documents of interest, tucked them under his clothes, and then delivered them to Kang at Pei Pu's apartment. The MPS agent copied the files, and Boursicot returned them to the archive. In total, he may have handed over to the Chinese up to 500 classified documents. As Bernard secured MPS protection for his secret lover and their child, he couldn't help but notice that their relationship was slowly fading away. Pei Pu's mother and Officer Kang were almost always around, which meant they had very little time to have sex, which was infrequent, quick, and awkward, as described by Joyce Wadler. Boursicot and Shu are lucky to make love twice a month. It's always rushed, and Shu is as controlling as ever. Pei Pu was controlling and demanding also out of the bedroom, asking Bernard to bring her back long lists of luxury items from his travels to Shanghai or Hong Kong. But even if Bernard didn't love her anymore, she was still a friend and the mother of his child. In the spring of 1972, Boursicot was due to return to France, and he tried to persuade Kang to allow Pei Pu out of the country. The agent flatly refused, but once again Bernard promised he would be back. And he did, once again. It was November 15th, 1973, Bernard had quit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was in Beijing on a tourist visa. The excesses of the Cultural Revolution had partially subsided, allowing for a Westerner to go and visit his Chinese friend without scrutiny. On that day, Bernard was in for a big surprise. As Pei Pu opened the door, Bernard could see a 7-year-old boy happily playing on the floor. It was him, Bertrand, or Dudu. A few months earlier, as the political climate had become less oppressive, Pei Pu and her mum had brought Dudu back home. Officially, the boy was declared an orphan and the Shus had adopted him. The family reunion did not last long though, as Boursicot's visa quickly expired, but Bernard and Pei Pu arranged a meeting with Kang, now a family friend, during which they asked him to watch over and protect Du Du. Over the next 4 years, Kang was true to his word, and the Shus led a quiet life. Bernard had little contact with them, but he kept thinking of Pei Pu, and especially of Du Du. By 1975, Bernard had rejoined the Foreign Service and was living with his new love, a young man 6 years his junior called Thierry. Of course, he didn't know anything about Pei Pu and Du Du. Then, on January 8th, 1976, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai died, an event which attracted much attention from the media. The intensive coverage of Chinese affairs eventually prompted Bernard to blurt out the truth to Thierry. He had a child with a Chinese woman who lived disguised as a male. He didn't love her anymore, but he would try anything to bring her and their son to Paris. The occasion to resume contact with them came in early 1977, when the French embassy in Mongolia's capital, Ulaanbaatar, had an opening for an archivist. Boursicot nailed the application and moved to Mongolia. By April, he was able to sneak to Beijing, to reunite with Pei Pu and Du Du, sure, but mostly to talk shop with good old Kang. Back then, the revisionist Soviets had stationed 20 army divisions in Mongolia, plus 35,000 technical advisors. Perhaps the MPS was interested in hearing about their activities and movements, and thus, Bernard started spying again, grabbing any file of interest from the mailroom at Ulaanbaatar. Every 6 weeks, he returned to Beijing, where he could spend 36 hours at Pei Pu's house without attracting attention. He had reassured Thierry that Pei Pu was just a friend, but the two did have occasional sex, although it was far from satisfying. Now Pei Pu demanded that Bernard cover his eyes and increased her demands for luxury items. Boursicot pondered that he might as well be the only double agent in the world who had to pay for the privilege to spy on his own country. The intelligence he provided to Kang, moreover, was far from useful. The stolen diplomatic cables only contained gossip about Mongolian communist leaders and their weird fashion choices. Apparently they had a strange love for mafia-style fedora hats, but nothing of relevance about Soviet troop movements. After 16 months, Kang confronted Boursicot and asked him to please stop stealing the documents. Probably the first time ever in which a handler asked his asset to stop spying. Bernard would have stopped anyhow though, as he was recalled to Paris and then assigned to his new posting, Belmopan, Belize's capital. It was there that Bernard conceived a simple yet genius plan to exfiltrate Pei Pu and Du Du. Mr. Shi Pei Pu was, after all, a playwright, actor and singer of a certain renown. Why not ask the French Ministry of Culture to invite him to Paris for a series of lectures? The application was successful, and on October 9th, 1982, Pei Pu and Du Du landed in Paris carrying a 3-month cultural visa. Pei Pu and Du Du moved in with Thierry and Bernard, all the while maintaining a complex charade of identities. Bernard introduced 15-year-old Du Du as his son and Pei Pu as the boy's uncle. When asked about the boy's mother, Bernard's response was simply, "We'll see about that later." Uncle Pei Pu impressed French audiences with his performances in female disguise, and the visa was extended to 1 year. Bernard had realised for good that he was no longer attracted to Pei Pu, his love for her having completely evaporated. Nonetheless, the friendship between the civil servant and the Chinese singer was evident, and it attracted the scrutiny of France's counter-espionage outfit, the Direction for the Surveillance of the Territory, or DST. Which takes us back to the start of this episode. On June 30th, 1983, 2 DST inspectors grabbed Bernard Boursicot on a busy Parisian avenue, loaded him onto a car, and sped away. The inspectors had done their homework, realising that more than 500 documents had been pilfered from the embassy mailroom in Beijing from 1969 to 1972, and then again in Ulaanbaatar from 1977 to 1979. And who had been employed by those officers during exactly those time periods? Bernard crumbled and confessed that yes, he had spied on his own country, but he'd never done it for money. He had done it to protect Shi Pei Pu. An inspector asked, "Who is Shi Pei Pu?" Boursicot replied, "Pei Pu is a woman." The inspectors were stunned at first, but then they put 2 and 2 together. Pei Pu had left China disguised as a man, and Du Du was her son. Bernard corrected them. He was also his son. On July 1st, Bernard was formally charged with espionage. On the 6th, The DST arrested Shi Pei Pu too. The scandal erupted on the front pages of the Parisian papers, seasoned with plenty of ingredients to entice the general public. A civil servant had been spying for Beijing in order to protect his celebrity singer lover and their child, a lover who happened to be a biological female raised as a male who specialised in performing female roles on stage. The interpretation of events was confirmed by a DST report. Shi Pei Pu was raised right from the start as a boy by her mother. Her true nature was hidden from everyone until this day. Investigating judge Bruno Laroche sought to understand better this enigmatic Mr. and Mrs. Xu, and especially if she had been directly involved in spycraft, but she denied everything. I was unaware that my friend Bernard Boursicot had given documents to the Chinese authorities, and most particularly to an individual named Kang, whom he would meet at my home in Beijing outside of my presence and without me knowing about it. Laroche decided to proceed with the trial anyways, and ordered for Pei Pu to be put in custody. Now, Pei Pu was still officially Mr. Xu and had refused to undergo a medical examination. That is why she was briefly detained at a male prison while Judge Laroche mandated a compulsory examination to take place. On the evening of July 13th, Bernard was lying in his cell, listening to the radio, when the results of the exam were revealed on the evening news. The announcer read, "The Chinese Mata Hari, who was accused of spying, is a man." Bernard was stunned. It's not possible. It's unbelievable. It's a lie. He had had sex with Pei Pu, and they even had a child together. What about Dudu? Pei Pu threw another curveball at the prosecutors, claiming that Dudu was in fact Boursicot's son, conceived via artificial insemination. After having intercourse with Bernard, Pei Pu had collected some of his semen and preserved it to then impregnate another woman whose identity remains unknown. Okay, but that doesn't explain how Bernard and Pei Pu could have slept together. Sure, their sexual encounters were infrequent, quick, awkward, and carefully directed by Pei Pu, but they had penetrative sex after all. It's time to provide some answers. At the official medical examination, the doctors found that Shi Pei Pu was a man, with normal sexual organs that show no trace of surgical intervention. Pei Pu then volunteered to offer a demonstration to the doctors, quoting again from Joyce Wadler, "Easily, smoothly, he pushes his testicles up into his body cavity. The skin of the scrotal sac hangs slack, like curtains. The man now pushes his penis between his legs, towards his back, bisecting the skin of the scrotum, and squeezes his legs tightly together. The penis is hidden, while the skin of the scrotum resembles the vaginal lips, beneath a triangle of pubic hair. Pushed between the empty scrotal sac, the penis has also created a small cavity so that shallow penetration is possible. A naive or credulous lover looking at this man now might believe he was looking at a woman. Of course, one could not look too closely. It was only an illusion." What had started as a run-of-the-mill espionage scandal had now escalated into a complex, murky, nearly unbelievable sexual affair. For almost 6 months, Boursicot stirred in his cell. He was frustrated, humiliated, but most of all, thirsty for answers. At the end of January 1984, Judge Laroche finally allowed for Bernard and Pei Pu to meet. Bernard had one simple question. "Why didn't you tell me?" To which Pei Pu replied, "There was never any time." Bernard felt fooled and betrayed, but he still had his son Dudu to think about. Unfortunately, another blow was round the corner. In June 1984, blood tests confirmed that Xu Dudu was not related to Boursicot. Pei Pu confessed they had been adopted by the Xu family from destitute parents in the Xinjiang region. This area is home to the Uyghurs, a people of Turkic origin whose genetic makeup is an admixture of European, Siberian, and Asian ancestral components. In other words, a Uyghur boy could be mistaken for the son of a European man and a Chinese woman. But why had Pei Pu and his mother gone to such lengths to adopt Dudu? According to French newspaper Libération, the boy may have been provided by the MPS as an added bargaining chip to ensure Boursicot's cooperation. The truth is that nobody, let alone Bernard, would ever receive satisfying answers from Pei Pu. Was he actually an MPS agent or simply an informant? What reason did he have to lie about his gender first and then about being pregnant later? And what was his master plan? It seems unlikely that Pei Pu's main objective was to recruit Bernard as a double agent from the start, given the mundane nature of his work at the embassy. Perhaps Pei Pu only saw Bernard as a possible means to leave China. Or perhaps he was truly in love with the Frenchman and thought that the only way to keep him on his side was to orchestrate a decades-long ruse. The latest revelation proved too much to bear for Bernard. One night, alone in his cell, Boursicot extracted the blades from his plastic razor and slit his own throat. Luckily, the blades were made from plastic too. The cuts were not deep, and Bernard's life was saved. Boursicot could not avoid the trial on charges of espionage and treason, which took place in May 1986. Bernard and Pei Pu's lawyers insisted that the two were far from being master spies, but rather two beings, both of whom are psychologically fragile and exalted, who entered into the same dream where each will believe what the other is saying because they both want to believe it. If this case is anything, it's a crime of passion. Bernard genuinely believed Pei Pu to be a woman and the mother of his child. But is that truly a crime? When the prosecution pointed out that Bernard had indeed leaked classified files to the mysterious Kang, his lawyer retorted that the documents carried worthless intelligence. As he put it, "This case is absolutely at the bottom of the ladder in the spying world." The jury was not convinced. Boursicot and Shi were sentenced to 6 years in jail, but less than a year later, in April 1987, President François Mitterrand issued a pardon for Shi Pei Pu, a move designed to establish a good relationship with Beijing. 4 months later, the pardon was extended to Bernard Boursicot. This double pardon brought an end to one of the most, if not the most, puzzling scandals of the Cold War. In the years that followed, Bernard and Pei Pu only met sporadically. The latter continued to live in the spotlight as a Chinese opera performer. He was interviewed on several occasions, but always refused to discuss his troubled romance with Boursicot, and he certainly would not reveal his degree of involvement with the MPS. As per Bernard, he simply faded into the background, happy to be forgotten and ignored. By 2009, he was residing in a nursing home. In that year, he met Pei Pu again for the first time. During the encounter, Pei Pu told his friend that he still loved him. Unsurprisingly, Bernard did not reciprocate the feeling. Shi Pei Pu died shortly after, on June 30th, 2009, age 70. When Bernard learned about his death, he didn't hide his relief. The curtains are closed after a painful chapter in his life. "He did so many things against me that he had no pity for. I think it's stupid to play another game now and say I'm sad. The plate is clean now. I am free."